On June 18, 1815, the smoke of battle at Waterloo, Belgium, gradually cleared following a torrential downpour. On the muddy battlefield lay the bodies of nearly 50,000 soldiers, strewn in disarray. Blood flowed down the ravines into the low-lying ground, staining the very earth beneath their feet crimson. This brutal battle, which raged for an entire day, not only utterly shattered Napoleon Bonaparte's dream of a comeback and brought his legendary, tumultuous political career to a definitive end, but also marked the formal conclusion of the French era, a period spanning nearly 3 decades since the French Revolution of 1789. As Napoleon's Imperial Guard laid down their arms and surrendered under the siege of the Allied forces, and as the Corsican lion, who had once swept across Europe, was compelled to abdicate once again, the edifice of the First French Empire came crashing down. At this juncture, Europe stood as if at a crossroads atop a landscape of ruins. The lands once conquered by the French Revolution and Napoleon were in dire need of reconstruction. The old order, having been overturned, yearned for restoration. Yet beneath the rubble, new ideas and forces were quietly stirring. How would France, in the aftermath of Waterloo, struggle to survive and rise from the abyss of defeat? And how would Europe, following such upheaval, construct a new international order? This period of history is not merely a chronicle of shifting power dynamics and territorial partition. It is, more profoundly, a contest between old and new civilizations, a time of painful social fractures, and the very gestation of the modern world as we know it. Today, let us step back into the Europe of the post-Waterloo era to explore this momentous chapter of history, one that, though once obscured by the smoke of battle, continues to exert a profound and lasting influence. In Paris's Place de la Concorde, the carriage of Louis XVIII rolled slowly past, the citizens watched with expressions of complex emotion, a mixture of awe, discontent, and weary apathy. We begin by examining France in the wake of its defeat, how this former hegemon of Europe, stripped of Napoleon's protection, found itself mired in a quagmire of difficulties and struggles. This period marks the Second Bourbon Restoration in French history, a difficult era that oscillated ceaselessly between the forces of restoration and the tremors of instability. French domestic affairs, struggling between restoration and turmoil. 1. Political compromise, the hypocrisy and fragility of constitutional monarchy. When news of the defeat at Waterloo reached Paris, the entire city plunged into panic and chaos. Napoleon's supporters went into hiding. Republicans were gripped by anxiety, while royalists seized the opportunity to rise up, cheering as they welcomed back their king, Louis XVIII. This restored monarch of the Bourbon dynasty did not return amidst the cheers of the French people. Rather, he set foot on Parisian soil once again under the protection of the bayonets of the anti-French coalition. By this time, Louis XVIII was no longer the spirited prince of his youth. Having endured years of exile and hardship, he understood deeply that, having undergone the baptism of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire, French society was no longer the same as it had been before the Revolution. To attempt a return to absolute monarchy would be nothing short of a pipe dream. Consequently, upon ascending the throne, Louis XVIII was compelled to make compromises, preserving certain achievements of the Napoleonic era. The most representative of these was the Charter of 1814, promulgated that same year. This charter established a constitutional monarchy in France. While ostensibly granting the people certain rights, it was, in reality, a meticulously crafted political compromise. Under the Charter of 1814, a parliament was established in France, divided into a chamber of peers and a chamber of deputies. The parliament held legislative power, and the king's authority was subject to certain limitations. However, the limitations of this charter were glaringly obvious. Suffrage was strictly restricted to a tiny wealthy elite. Only male citizens with an annual income exceeding 300 francs possessed the right to vote, while the vast majority of the French population at the time, farmers, laborers, and ordinary citizens, were excluded from political participation. This meant that political power effectively remained in the hands of the old aristocracy and the haute bourgeoisie. The so-called constitutional monarchy served merely as a fig leaf for the old guard to mask their efforts to preserve their own interests. Louis XVIII's compromises were not born of sincerity, but were rather forced by circumstances. He had to simultaneously appease anti-royalist sentiments within the country and cater to the demands of the anti-French coalition, struggling to maintain his rule while caught precariously between these conflicting forces. Meanwhile, the old nobility, impatient to reclaim the lands and privileges they had lost, relentlessly pressured Louis XVIII to repeal Napoleonic-era policies and restore the pre-revolutionary order. This internal contradiction and tug-of-war rendered France's political system fragile from its very inception. The friction between the parliament and the king, coupled with the conflict between the old nobility and the bourgeoisie, continuously exacerbated France's political instability. 2. The White Terror and factional strife. The bloody agony of a fractured society. Following the defeat at Waterloo, the ultra-royalists, also known as the ultras, meaning extremists, seized the opportunity to rise to power. They channeled the full fury of their defeat onto Bonapartists, Republicans, and anyone who had supported the French Revolution or Napoleon, launching a brutal campaign of retribution, an event historically known as the White Terror. The ultra-royalists' methods of retaliation were exceptionally cruel. They conducted nationwide manhunts for Bonapartists and Republicans, resulting in the dismissal, arrest, and even execution of thousands of officials. Among these victims, none evokes greater pathos than Napoleon's Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, who had followed Napoleon through countless campaigns and distinguished himself with legendary feats of arms. After the Battle of Waterloo, Ney chose to surrender to Louis XVIII, believing his life would be spared. Instead, he was ultimately sentenced to death by the ultra-royalists. On December 7, 1815, Ney was executed by firing squad in Paris's Luxembourg Gardens. Refusing a blindfold in his final moments, he faced the muzzles of the guns directly and shouted, "Long live France," thereby defining, with his very life, the true meaning of a soldier's loyalty and dignity. Beyond Ney, countless ordinary Bonapartists and Republicans also fell victim to persecution. Some were exiled overseas, others stripped of their property, and still others sent to the guillotine. Statistics indicate that during the White Terror, in the southern French region of Toulon alone, over 200 people were executed. Nationwide, the number of individuals arrested or exiled reached into the thousands. This frenzied mentality of vengeance, far from appeasing social tensions, instead exacerbated the hatred and division within French society. The old nobility, staunch supporters of the Bourbon Restoration, stood in bitter opposition to the populace, who remained nostalgic for the Napoleonic Empire. Meanwhile, the conflict between Republicans and Royalists intensified, plunging the entirety of France into a maelstrom of bloody turmoil. Concurrently, partisan strife within France grew increasingly fierce. Beyond the ultra-royalists, the political landscape was populated by a multitude of factions, including moderate royalists, liberals, Republicans, and Bonapartists, all of whom engaged in mutual attacks and internecine maneuvering in a relentless struggle for power. The moderate royalists advocated for the preservation of a constitutional monarchy and the balancing of competing interests. The liberals sought to expand democratic rights further and drive social progress. The Republicans adamantly opposed the monarchy, demanding the restoration of a republican form of government, while the Bonapartists remained perpetually nostalgic for Napoleon's rule, yearning for the day when the Bonaparte dynasty might once again seize the reins of power. The ceaseless struggle among these factions rendered France's political situation increasingly complex, leading to frequent changes in government and policies that shifted capriciously from one day to the next, leaving the French people to suffer agonizingly amidst the ensuing turbulence and chaos. 3. The heavy price of defeat, territorial cession, and a crushing blow to national dignity. Scene transition. An animated map of Europe appears. France's territory gradually shrinks back to its 1790 boundaries. Figures representing war indemnities slowly materialize on the screen, and Allied soldiers are seen patrolling the streets of France. Following the defeat at Waterloo, France faced not only internal turmoil, but also the heavy punitive measures imposed by the anti-French coalition. On November 20th, 1815, the coalition signed the Second Treaty of Paris with France. For the French nation, this treaty was undeniably a humiliating and unequal pact. It stripped France of vast territories, saddled the country with colossal war indemnities, and, perhaps most significantly, robbed it of the hegemonic status it had once held over Europe. In accordance with the terms of the treaty, France was compelled to relinquish all territories conquered through warfare since 1790, effectively shrinking its territorial boundaries back to their 1790 extent. This meant that France forfeited all control over regions such as the left bank of the Rhine, northern Italy, and Belgium. The nation that had once stood as the hegemon of Europe was now confined strictly within its own domestic borders. Even more galling to the French public was the fact that the anti-French coalition established a series of buffer states encircling France, a move designed to further stifle the nation's development and prevent any future resurgence. Beyond territorial concessions, France was also saddled with a colossal war indemnity of 700 million francs, a truly astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to several years' worth of the nation's total fiscal revenue. To meet this financial obligation, the French government was forced to hike taxes and squeeze the populace, thereby compounding the misery of a people already impoverished and devastated by years of conflict. Furthermore, the treaty stipulated that the coalition forces would remain stationed on French soil for a period of 3 years, at France's own expense, where they proceeded to flaunt their power and act with unbridled impunity. Although these Allied soldiers were nominally present to oversee France's compliance with the treaty, in reality, they functioned as an occupying force, one whose true purpose was to humiliate the defeated nation. Stationed on French soil, they moved freely through French towns and cities, plundering resources, harassing civilians, and even meddling in domestic affairs, ensuring that the French people felt the sting of defeat and humiliation at every turn. What the French found most intolerable was the fact that they were required not only to feed and house this occupying force, but also to endure the myriad troubles they inflicted. These soldiers engaged in every manner of misconduct. Some were prone to drunken brawling, others committed robbery, and still others harassed local women. Yet, the French government, outraged but powerless to speak out, could only watch helplessly as their fellow citizens were bullied and their nation trampled underfoot. This sense of subjugation, of living at the mercy of foreign powers, proved even more agonizing to the French than the loss of territory or the payment of indemnities. It deeply wounded their national pride and intensified their longing for the bygone glory and splendor of the Napoleonic era. The signing of the Second Treaty of Paris marked the definitive end of France's status as the dominant power in Europe, relegating the nation to the ranks of a second-tier state. From that moment on, France could no longer intervene in European affairs at will, as it had during the Napoleonic era, nor could it continue to aggressively invade other nations with impunity. Its every move was subjected to the close scrutiny and strict constraints of the anti-French coalition, and its future was held firmly in the coalition's grasp. This treaty served as a heavy yoke, clamped tightly upon France, plunging the nation into a prolonged period of decline. Over the ensuing decades, France repeatedly strove to cast off this yoke and reclaim its former glory, yet each attempt was met with suppression and countermeasures from the coalition. It was not until many decades later that France gradually emerged from the shadow of defeat and rose once again to become a major European power. However, the Europe of that time was no longer a continent dominated by a single French hegemon. Rather, it had evolved into a multipolar Europe, an entirely new era of equilibrium. The Vienna system, a reshaping of European power. While France struggled in the quagmire of defeat, the victorious nations were convening a grand division of spoils within the opulent palaces of Vienna. This gathering is known to history as the renowned Congress of Vienna. The Congress spanned from September 1814 to June 1815. Representatives from nearly every European nation attended, totaling hundreds of delegates, and the proceedings were punctuated by a ceaseless round of banquets, balls, and social engagements, earning the event the playful nickname, the Dancing Congress. Yet, beneath the surface of clinking glasses, music, and revelry lay a fierce struggle, a series of intense political maneuvers and heated disputes as national representatives vied for their respective countries' interests. The scenes of the Congress of Vienna remain indelible. Delegates seated or standing, their expressions a study in varied demeanor. The portrait of Austrian Chancellor Metternich, his gaze deep and calculating, and interspersed throughout, the signing ceremonies of the Quadruple Alliance and the drafting of a new map of Europe, in which national borders were redrawn. The proceedings of the Congress of Vienna were presided over by the Austrian Empire's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Clemens von Metternich. Metternich was a statesman of exceptional political acumen and diplomatic talent. He deeply understood the principles of the balance of power and was adept at exploiting the rivalries among nations to safeguard the interests of the Austrian Empire. His objective was not to utterly destroy France, for doing so would create a power vacuum on the European continent that would likely trigger even greater chaos. Nor was it to restore the old European order, which had long since been completely shattered by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Rather, his goal was to establish a stable and balanced new European order, one capable of simultaneously preventing a resurgence of French power and curbing the expansionist ambitions of Russia and Prussia, thereby preserving Austria's preeminent position within Europe. Alongside Metternich, three other central figures dominated the Congress of Vienna: Tsar Alexander I of Russia, King Frederick William III of Prussia, and Lord Castlereagh of Great Britain. These four individuals represented the four most powerful nations in Europe at the time. The interplay of their rivalries and compromises ultimately determined the political landscape of post-war Europe. Alexander I was an ambitious czar who styled himself the liberator of Europe, though in reality, his aim was to expand Russia's sphere of influence and establish himself as the continent's hegemon. He advocated for the complete weakening of France, going so far as to propose the partition of French territory in order to secure greater gains for Russia. Concurrently, he supported the cause of Polish independence, seeking to establish a Russian-controlled Kingdom of Poland to serve as a strategic buffer zone for his empire. Frederick William III, by contrast, was a conservative monarch intent on restoring both Prussia's territorial integrity and its national prestige. He even harbored ambitions of supplanting France to become the dominant power on the European continent. He called for the severe punishment of France, specifically demanding the annexation of the French Rhineland, in order to acquire additional territory and resources. Furthermore, he sought to annex the Kingdom of Saxony, thereby expanding Prussia's influence within the German states. Lord Castlereagh was a cool-headed and pragmatic diplomat. His objective was not to secure hegemony over the European continent, but rather to establish a continental balance of power that would safeguard Great Britain's maritime trade and colonial interests. Consequently, he sought to prevent any single power, whether France, Russia, or Prussia, from becoming overly dominant. Consequently, he advocated for preserving France's territorial integrity in order to maintain the balance of power on the European continent. Simultaneously, he opposed the excessive expansion of Russia and Prussia so as to safeguard British interests. Each of these four nations harbored its own calculations and pursued its own distinct objectives. At the Congress of Vienna, they engaged in fierce disputes and strategic maneuvering. Russia and Prussia advocated for the severe punishment of France and the complete dismantling of its power, whereas Britain and Austria argued for preserving France's integrity to maintain the continental balance. Ultimately, after months of intense wrangling and bargaining, the nations reached a series of compromises that established the Vienna system for post-war Europe. At the core of this system lay the principles of legitimacy and the balance of power. Legitimacy referred to the restoration of the old feudal dynasties across Europe, dynasties that had been overthrown during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, such as the House of Bourbon in France and Spain, and the House of Savoy in Italy. The restoration of these old dynasties was intended to reinstate the old European order, to suppress revolutionary movements, and to uphold the rule of feudal monarchs. The balance of power principle aimed to establish a stable equilibrium of forces on the European continent through the redrawing of territorial boundaries. This was designed to prevent France, or indeed any single nation, from becoming overly dominant, thereby averting the recurrence of war and ensuring a lasting peace in Europe. Guided by the principles of legitimacy and the balance of power, the Congress of Vienna undertook a radical redrawing of Europe's political map. France was stripped of all territories conquered in 1790, with its borders being rolled back to their 1790 configuration. Prussia acquired the Rhineland region and a portion of the Kingdom of Saxony, thereby significantly bolstering its power. Austria gained control of the Lombardy and Venetia regions in Italy, consolidating its dominion over the peninsula. Russia secured the majority of Polish territory, establishing a Kingdom of Poland in which the Tsar served concurrently as king. Finally, Britain acquired a vast array of overseas colonies, including the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Malta, thereby cementing its status as the preeminent maritime power. To prevent the resurgence of France and simultaneously suppress revolutionary movements across Europe, Russia, Prussia, and Austria signed the Holy Alliance in September 1815, pledging to uphold feudal monarchical rule in Europe in accordance with Christian principles. Subsequently, Great Britain joined their ranks, forming the Quadruple Alliance to collectively maintain the stability of the Vienna system and jointly suppress revolutionary movements throughout Europe. The establishment of the Vienna system marked Europe's entry into a new historical era. This period came to be known as the Concert of Europe, or alternatively, the Age of Metternich. During this time, although European nations harbored internal contradictions and conflicts, they achieved a remarkable consensus regarding two objectives: maintaining the existing order and suppressing revolutionary movements. Through the convening of regular international conferences, they coordinated their respective interests, resolved their mutual disputes, and collectively upheld peace and stability across Europe. However, the Vienna system was fraught with contradictions and elements of instability from its very inception. It disregarded the aspirations of nationalism and turned a deaf ear to the calls for liberalism. Instead, it forcibly subjected the peoples of Europe to the rule of old dynasties and ruthlessly suppressed revolutionary ideas through feudal autocracy. It employed the politics of great powers to trample upon the interests of smaller nations, and utilized feudal dominion to stifle the will of the people. This stability, built upon the foundations of the old order, was destined to be inherently fragile and ultimately ephemeral. It resembled a palace built atop a volcanic crater, outwardly magnificent and resplendent, yet in reality, liable at any moment to be consumed by the fiery flames of revolution. Undercurrents of the Restoration era, the seeds of revolution. The tableau of this era was defined by the stark contrast between the slums and the affluent districts of Paris. On one side stood workers, ragged and gaunt, while on the other revealed the nobility, clad in silks and feasting in an atmosphere of carefree revelry. Scenes unfolded of university students gathering in secret assemblies to circulate banned books, of Carbonari conspirators carrying out assassinations, flames rising skyward amidst an atmosphere thick with tension. The prevailing social mood was somber and stifling, punctuated only occasionally by the sudden eruption of impassioned revolutionary anthems. Beneath the gilded facade of the Vienna system, and beneath the Bourbon monarchy's veneer of peace and festivity, powerful undercurrents were surging through the lower strata of European society. Although the defeat at Waterloo shattered Napoleon's empire, it could not extinguish the ideas bequeathed by the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, fraternity, and nationalism, the very flames that had once ignited the revolutionary fervor across Europe, had not been extinguished. Rather, they lay smoldering within the ashes, gathering strength as they awaited the opportune moment to erupt once more. In France, although the ultra-royalists endeavored to restore the ancien regime, the underlying social structure had already undergone a fundamental and irreversible transformation. Farmers were no longer vassals of feudal lords. They owned their own land, recognized their rights, and yearned for true freedom, a liberation from the oppression of the old aristocracy. Workers began to congregate in the cities. Exploited by capitalists and living in poverty, they craved fair treatment and sought to alter their destiny. The middle class grew increasingly powerful. Possessing both wealth and knowledge, they aspired to acquire political rights and participate in the governance of the nation. These emerging social forces could no longer be contained by the old order. They became the seeds of revolution, poised to erupt at any moment. The legendary tale of Napoleon did not vanish with his death. On the contrary, it spread widely among the populace, taking on a mythical aura. Veterans would gather around hearths, recounting to the younger generation their exploits fighting alongside the emperor across battlefields near and far, tales of the son of Austerlitz, and the glory beneath the pyramids. These stories ignited the passions of the youth and awakened within them a deep nostalgia for the era of the empire. They grew discontent with the conservative incompetence of the Bourbon dynasty and the decadent extravagance of the old nobility. They yearned for a return to the days of Napoleon, to see France once again become the hegemon of Europe and the center of the world. Napoleon's son, the King of Rome, though held under house arrest in Vienna by his maternal grandfather, the Emperor of Austria, remained a potent symbol in his very existence, a latent threat to the Bourbon dynasty. Bonapartists gathered in secret, plotting to overthrow the Bourbons and restore Napoleon's lineage to the imperial throne. They cultivated support within the military, disseminated their ideology among the masses, and waited patiently for the opportune moment to strike. In other parts of Europe, the seeds of revolution were also taking root. In the German lands, university students formed youth associations, secretly circulating banned books, debating the unification of Germany, and resisting the autocratic rule of feudal princes. They yearned to establish a unified, free German nation, to cast off the shackles of feudal fragmentation and, much like France, achieve national independence and democratic liberty. In 1817, at the Wartburg Festival, students burned reactionary books and chanted slogans of liberty and unity, giving voice to their dissatisfaction with the Vienna system and their defiance of feudal autocracy. In Italy, the Carbonari operated in secrecy, plotting uprisings to resist Austrian rule. Composed largely of the middle class and intellectuals, the Carbonari espoused the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They yearned to establish a unified, free Italian nation, one liberated from foreign oppression and possessed of true national independence. In 1820, an uprising erupted in Naples. Led by the Carbonari, the populace overthrew the feudal autocratic regime and established a constitutional monarchy. However, this uprising was swiftly crushed by Austrian forces, and the Carbonari were subjected to brutal persecution. Yet, they did not give up. They continued their struggle, persisting even amidst the darkness. In Spain and Portugal, liberals likewise launched uprisings, seeking to topple feudal autocracy and institute constitutional monarchies. Yet, these uprisings, too, were suppressed by the Holy Alliance. Acting under the alliance's mandate, French troops crossed the Pyrenees to quell the Spanish Revolution and restore the Spanish king to absolute power. Although these early revolutionary attempts ultimately ended in failure, they demonstrated that the seeds of revolution had taken root and begun to sprout, gathering strength as they awaited the opportune moment for their next eruption. The peace maintained by the bayonets of the Vienna system was akin to a massive powder keg, requiring only a single spark to trigger a cataclysmic explosion. Epilogue. After Waterloo, which way forward? In the aftermath of Waterloo, France was reduced to a diminished, somber territory, encircled by the predatory gazes of great powers such as Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Across the French landscape, a crimson undercurrent of revolution surged beneath the surface, rippling outward into neighboring nations. Waterloo was but a single battle, yet the river of history flows on, ceaseless and unending. The smoke of Waterloo has cleared, the era of Napoleon has drawn to a close, and French hegemony has met its end. Yet for France, the true story had only just begun. The humiliation of defeat, the awkwardness of the Restoration, the bloodshed of the White Terror, and the shackles of the Treaty of Paris, all these plunged France into an unprecedented nadir. But a nadir does not signify an end. Rather, it may well harbor the seeds of new hope. The resilience and pride of the French nation were not shattered by the defeat at Waterloo. Those veterans who yearned for the glory of the empire, those middle-class citizens who craved liberty and equality, and those young people steeped in revolutionary ideals, none of them abandoned their hope for the future. In the darkness, they quietly gathered their strength, awaiting the arrival of the next opportunity. Meanwhile, Europe, too, entered a brand new era. The concert of Europe was established, yet from its very inception, it was rife with contradictions and elements of instability. It employed feudal autocracy to suppress revolutionary thought, great power politics to stifle the interests of smaller nations, and the old order to repress emerging forces. Such repression was, by its very nature, destined to be short-lived. The seeds of revolution were taking root and sprouting within the lower strata of European society. They would eventually burst through the fetters of the old order, ushering in a new age. In the aftermath of Waterloo, Europe entered a 40-year span known as the Age of Metternich. It was an era of relative peace, yet one also seething with undercurrents of unrest. During this period, although European nations harbored conflicts, they maintained a fundamental peace through the coordination of the great powers. Revolutionary movements, though repeatedly suppressed, never ceased their struggle, and the Industrial Revolution flourished. Social structures underwent dramatic transformation, and new ideas and forces emerged in ceaseless succession. Following Waterloo, France was no longer the master of Europe, yet it remained the epicenter of European culture, thought, and art. In the salons of Paris, intellectuals engaged in spirited debates on liberty, equality, and fraternity. In the city's cafes, artists captured the changing times through the strokes of their brushes and the power of their pens. and on the streets of Paris, workers and students gathered in secret, plotting the next revolution. The defeat at Waterloo in 1815 marked France's precipitous fall from the pinnacle of European hegemony. It signaled the demise of the Napoleonic Empire and the restoration of the old order. Yet, this did not signify the end of French history, nor the end of European history. On the contrary, it marked merely the beginning of a new narrative, a fresh saga of revolution and restoration, of liberty versus despotism, and of nationalism amidst the interplay of great powers. Napoleon once remarked, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a single step." Waterloo saw France tumble from the heights of the sublime. Yet, history has proven that even after a fall, one eventually rises again. The national spirit of France was not shattered by the defeat at Waterloo. Rather, it gathered strength amidst humiliation, sought light within the darkness, and waited in silence for its next resurgence. In 1830, the July Revolution erupted, and the Bourbon dynasty was once again overthrown. In 1848, the February Revolution broke out, toppling the July monarchy and establishing the Second Republic. In 1852, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, proclaimed himself emperor, founding the Second Empire. Amidst this turbulence, France sought its path forward. Amidst this constant flux, it pursued progress. Waterloo was not an end, but a new beginning. It ushered in an entirely new era, one rife with contradictions and conflicts, yet also brimming with hope and transformation. The great river of history never ceases its flow, and we shall watch with anticipation, bearing witness to the dawn of the next era. Dear viewers, thank you for tuning in. I am your time navigator, Lawrence. Join me as we explore the truths of history. By observing the lives of others, we discern our own strengths and weaknesses. By studying history, we understand the cycles of rise and fall. Let us strive together for the cause of global civilization and peace. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with fellow history enthusiasts.